Anyway, good afternoon. I'm Julie Lerman, and so for me, it's still morning, and I'm actually in the same time zone as Bill, not even too far away from him. I think it's about 6 hours by car, or maybe 5 hours by car. I've driven there in nice weather. I also drove there once in a terrible snowstorm, so maybe that was what I remember, 6 hours. So you have just been inundated with code, because, Bill Wagner talking about C#, that is about as good as it's going to get. So now you get a break from code. I'm not talking about code. I'm not talking about entity framework today, although I might mention it a couple of times. I'm talking about domain-driven design. So this is all ideas and concepts. So a nice way to end the day, maybe even you're doing that with a beer or a glass of wine, or, a cup of nice, soothing end of the day tea. So the title of this talk is very intentional: pragmatic or principled, because of the approaches people take to teach or share domain-driven design. And sometimes it can be pragmatic, and sometimes people are very focused on principles. And I'm a little different than that when I teach it. So as I'm doing this talk, I want to make sure you understand that I'm looking for why I see a mouse in the screen. Oh, well. Meta. I want to make sure you understand that the things I'll be talking about are relevant whether you're on your own journey and thinking about learning domain-driven design, or have started learning domain-driven design. But also, what's important to me is to help people who already know DDD and love domain-driven design and want to help others learn it as well. So this is kind of this is a talk that embraces both perspectives. And just a little background on this talk. I was at a domain-driven design conference, DDD Europe, which is going to be in person again this year. And being an entity framework person, I had done a workshop on how to, if you're using domain-driven design, to think about how to design your classes. How does entity framework do with mapping those classes to the database? So every time a new version of EF or EF Core comes out, I actually do that research to see how much easier it is to map to the database. And then, so I was thinking about it afterwards, having had some conversations, and I wrote this tweet about how EF Core and this is a bunch of years ago, how entity framework core might still not be ready for DD design purists. And there were a few people who were not very happy that I used this word purists, but actually it led to some really, really good conversations, and I made some new friends, which is always important when you have disagreements. That's a great way for me to get around them and kind of embrace all the ideas. But it gave me the idea of doing this talk about, perspectives on domain-driven design and this kind of purist idea. But then as I thought about it more, I was like, well, maybe the term I used, could have been better. Maybe instead of saying purist, maybe what I really meant was principled. People who are, when you really care a lot about the principles of domain-driven design. And, suddenly that doesn't really sound so bad, does it? But then my question, because I'm a very pragmatic person, is can we be pragmatic about the ideas and evolving your understanding of how you use domain and how you can benefit from domain-driven design, but still retain the principles? And that's always something that's been really important to me, because I think when people are focused on the principles, it gets harder to learn, right? It's a lot more daunting when you're focused on the principles. So people really focus on the rules and definitions of domain-driven design, and it makes it really hard for people who want to learn it because they're overwhelmed by, by these rules, by these principles, and it does tend to shut people out. And it's not just domain-driven design that's like that. There's a lot of learning. It does make people feel unwelcome, right? Because it's just, oh my God, I have to learn all this stuff before I can even use it. And so that is very different than how I approach sharing ideas with people, how I approach learning myself as well. I actually have heard this a lot, but an interesting experience I had was I had a lead architect at a company in Europe got in touch with me, and he was somebody who's very excited about domain-driven design and really wanted to have their software embrace these ideas. So he started teaching people about domain-driven design, and his approach to teaching it is nothing, he was a wonderful, wonderful man. We've gotten to be good friends, but his approach to teaching it was just kind of slamming too many details on people. And the development teams were saying, I don't want to hear any more about domain-driven design. So I actually went there and spent a week and kind of undid the problem that had been created by this, and really brought the team around by finding a gentler way to teach them and share with domain-driven design. So a big question about how to share it, whether you're on the end of you're sharing it with other people, or on the end of you're learning it, right? Where do you start? Do you start with the different parts of domain-driven design, or do you start with the core principles? Where does one start? So a lot of times people's first experience with domain-driven design is seeing the DDD mind map. So this comes out of Eric Evans' book, the original, like Eric Evans is I'll just say father. He and I are about the same age, so I don't want to say grandfather. Eric Evans really is the father of domain-driven design. And actually, these ideas came out of his experience having worked with a lot of really large organizations, banks, big companies. And he'd had a lot of success with them as guiding them to build software. And he finally decided to sit down and think about what it was that he was doing, what patterns he was using that was giving this kind of success. And that's where the book came from. He spent a couple of years writing it, and he really codified the idea. So this is a mind map of, the big picture.
Julie, sorry to interrupt. I think Zoom it's acting out again. The share screen just stopped suddenly.
Okay, I'll share again. Where
the green button.
Yeah, no, I got that, but where did it, was it, have they seen this? Have you all seen this?
Nope.
So,
no, I can see it.
Okay, and you see it now. So
yeah.
This is just curious. Did you see that? It doesn't matter. You heard it. You heard me talking about it. So this is the mind map of the big picture of domain-driven design. And a lot of times this is people's very first exposure to domain-driven design, which is really, really overwhelming, right? It was to me, believe me, I was just like, where do I even start? How do I even understand this? So I am not a fan of starting with, here is all of domain-driven design, except for one purpose, which is to say, this is the mind map of all of domain-driven design. You can be aware of it, but don't worry about learning it all yet. We're going to start small and then grow and grow and grow your understanding of different pieces of the map and how they interact with each other, how they work together. So that is that's okay, but as long as you understand that, as opposed to like, how am I going to learn all this stuff? Because it is overwhelming. So another, another problem that goes along with that is when people say to learners, you a learner or your people you're teaching, okay, now we're going to do domain-driven design, right? And then they start spewing out all of the terms of domain-driven design. And I also do not think that that is a very good approach, because again, it kind of makes this this presentation that you have to know the whole thing, right? If you're going to do domain-driven design. So I am not a fan of that approach either. All right. And then, and then it follows up with all this terminology. Okay, we're going to use aggregate roots and value objects and, all these different terminology. Like, that's, again, like when people are throwing terms at me and I have no idea what they're talking about, my brain just shuts down. I cannot absorb it. And I know there's a lot of people like that. So my approach is not to tell them that we're doing domain-driven design, or not to tell them what these different things are, but to just do it, show them. And then once people or you as a learner understand that concept, then I say, oh, by the way, in domain-driven design, this has a name. We have a name for it, and it's called, value object, or it's called aggregate root or whatever, instead of saying, you need, here's the term and you get blocked. And believe me, I do that a lot. And I did that a lot with domain-driven design as well. I would be, reading an article or reading a book and seeing this term over and over again, but I didn't understand it yet. And I just start glazing over. So I heard a great talk by Michael Feathers a few years ago at, surprise, another domain-driven design conference. And he was talking about inside out architecture, inside out design, where, do you start with a language and go to the structure, or start with a structure and go to the language? And I really liked that. That resonated with me because it aligned so nicely with my idea of how I like to share not just domain-driven design, but different ideas with people, right? Show them the structure and then give them the language that goes with that structure. That works really nicely for me and for a lot of people. So I know that it seems to be this natural propensity with people in the DDD community. They like to use an analogy to gardening. So using a garden analogy, my approach is you can start with, a garden like this. I get a bunch of old tires I found down the road in the gully, not really in the gully, painted them. This is not my garden, by the way. This is a free to use picture I found on the internet. And maybe they've taken plants that are still in pots and just stuck them in the holes, right? But it's a great start to having some kind of a garden. And every time I look at this and I see what looks like a thermometer on the upper right hand corner, I really hope that's not the temperature in any way. 120 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius would be pretty bad. Anyway, this is where I start. And I say, okay, I have a garden. I'm gardening, right? And, maybe someday, not me, I'll never have this, right? But you don't have to start with thinking this is what you need to do. You don't have to have this, extreme garden that's managed by 50 people, right? That takes a long time to evolve like this. We don't have to worry about starting like this. So within domain-driven design, where does one start? The most important concept in domain-driven design is called the bounded context. Not only is it the most important, but as Eric Evans himself has said, it is the most potentially misunderstood concept in domain-driven design. And interestingly, he said at some point years after he first published the book, which came out in 2003, he said, if I was to rewrite the book, I would start by explaining the bounded context, right? Not having it in the middle of the book. That's how important, not only how important it is, but how much, not just he, but many of us realize that if you don't understand the bounded context, then it starts getting hard to learn the rest. The bounded context is just one of those things in that huge mind map. So let me talk to you a little bit about the bounded context. And in the book, Eric makes a wonderful analogy to help that works very well for me. I don't know about others, but it works for me. So that's what I'll share, which is to compare it to cells. So this is a picture of a lot of cells, and each cell has a boundary of a membrane. That's the orange lines around the cells. And that membrane not only protects each cell, but it also prevents each cell from leaking information into the other cells, right? So it's the membranes that decide what can go between one cell and another and how it goes between one cell and another. And that is a really great perspective on what a bounded context is. In domain-driven design, each one of those cells would be a unique bounded context. And then the membranes, the orange lines that keep a boundary, right? They really contain, the cells are contained within those membranes. Those membranes are the boundary of a bounded context. And then we define rules about how different bounded contexts might interact with each other. But what's beautiful about this is that when you're thinking about solving your software problems, or your business problems using software, hopefully the software is not the problem, right? You're solving business problems by designing software. You can focus on one problem at a time and not worry about what's going on in the other cells, because eventually we know all we have to do is figure out how we're going to let those communicate with each other. And we'll go forward instead of backwards. So I didn't understand bounded context for quite a while I was using other ideas from domain-driven design. But what I did understand, the first thing I understood was the boundaries. I understood about using the boundaries. So the bounded context is more than just, taking a specific problem or set of connected problems, tightly connected problems, and creating a boundary around them. The boundary is just one important facet of the bounded context. So I understood the boundaries, but I did not understand the bounded context. And given that this is a .NET conference, and I can make a really good assumption that people know Entity Framework Core, in the early days of Entity Framework that came before Entity Framework Core, which I only mentioned for some of you younger developers or people newer to .NET, we were, the original way that Entity Framework worked was that we would take Entity Framework and point it to a database and say, build me a data model. And that database, we have our legacy databases. It could have 700 tables in it. There could be 1,500 or 4,000 relationships going on between all those tables. So when we started with EF, we would have this huge, crazy data model that was completely overwhelming, and everything was connected to each other. And it was just, you know, just really stressful to try to work in there, because everything's related to each other. And if I change something, you know, over here, it's going to affect all these other things because they're all connected. So one of the first things that I learned in applying, like using some of these ideas from domain-driven design, and I just want to stop and highlight the fact that I just referred to the ideas from DDD, right? DDD is not rules. It's a set of guidelines, and you can use them, right? So I'm taking ideas from DDD and benefiting greatly from them. So the first one that I was able to do was say, well, what if I created, you know, instead of everything in one data model, what if I had a whole bunch of data models, right? Remember EDMX? What if I had a whole bunch of those? Now, of course, luckily we have DB context, so we don't have that EDMX anymore. And then I could just focus on one thing within that data model. And all of us, you know, and not worry about the fact that it's connected here and connected there, right? I can deal with that connection sometime later, right? The connection might just be a foreign key, an integer, right? And then I could just take that integer and go over and talk to another bounded context or another group, you know, another small data model, right? So this wasn't really a bounded context yet, but the idea of the boundaries gave me so much power. And, you know, this is, to me, an expression of a great way to learn domain-driven design, because there are these great ideas in there. Even if you're not expert in all of the ideas and all of that big, huge mind map, there are ideas in there that you can still apply and benefit greatly from when you're designing your software. So, you know, that's me, right? Like me with my red hair, loving the domain-driven design book and DDD. And, you know, I had already been programming for like almost 20 years, definitely over 15 years before I learned about started learning, learned that it exists. And this was still way later, way after the book had been published. It took me a long time to come into it. And I have definitely embraced it, right, after all those years. But also, you know, I feel like I'm a pretty good example of evolving my understanding of domain-driven design, and at the same time, even without being this expert in every single thing that goes on in it, really taking advantage of it and benefiting from these great ideas. So I like to refer to myself as a canary in the coal mine. If anybody maybe from England or the US or places where coal is dug up, you might understand that reference. It's actually kind of sad. The miners would bring the canaries down into the coal mine to make sure the air was good. And the way they would find out if the air wasn't good is that the canaries would not do very well. So they, you know, the canaries were like, hey, something's wrong here. You know, you better go up and get some clean air. And I always refer to myself as a canary in the coal mine, because I like to, you know, try out this new stuff and figure out how to use it, and then make that learning a little easier for others. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about my path to learning domain-driven design, which was not looking at that huge mind map and saying, oh, okay, well, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I get it. Okay, I can do this, no problem. So first is understanding that, part of the terminology, domain-driven design, the name domain-driven design, is this word domain, which really means you're focusing on the business domain, what business, not what industry you're working on, but what is the focus of the business for whom you are writing the software, right? Just really understanding that. And right there was a huge shift for me, having come up, from the early 1990s, maybe a little sooner than that. I don't want to give away how old I really am. And, I was data focused, right? I was helping them write software. I would first think about, what does the data structure look like that I'm going to store the data? I was focused on the data structure and not on the actual problems that we're trying to solve, right? The data structure, and then, access. Does anybody remember access? You define the data tables, how you're going to store the data, and then you build user interfaces on top of those. But with domain-driven design, first and foremost, you're really focused on the problems you're trying to solve. And the problems are typically not how to store data, right? That's just kind of a side effect. It's a very important one, but it isn't the focus of what you're trying to solve, the problems you're trying to solve. So that was really, really important for me to understand that, this wasn't about how to store the data, but it was about understanding the problems of the business. Then, of course, I finally, I learned about the boundaries around bounded context, and I was really able to take advantage of an understanding of boundaries and start breaking things down. I wasn't creating bounded contexts, but I was still creating boundaries around different ideas and making my life a lot easier, right? By saying, I'm just going to focus on one thing here and not worry about all these other problems. It's very calming, right? It really takes away a lot of stress. And a lot of times when I'm working with clients and we're going through this process, and not the process of me teaching them domain-driven design, but the process of examining their business problems that they're trying to solve. And, first looking at it and saying, well, we've got to do this. And then whenever this happens, this other thing over here, we need to worry about that. And then I have to worry about this. And they say the word worry an awful lot, right? And I just say, okay, let's just calm down and let's just focus on this one thing, because we have patterns to allow us to, connect them after the fact, but we can solve these problems, specific problems, one bit at a time. Another important idea in domain-driven design is that each one of the bounded contexts itself, but when you have these bounded ideas, that each one of those would have a separate database. Now, this also is a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're thinking about, well, we use SQL Server and it's in the cloud. And if I have to have lots of instances of SQL Server, that's going to be really expensive. Or, if you're maintaining your own servers, like I have to maintain all these separate databases, and that's going to be really complicated. So, for me, I realize that that's kind of dated thinking, right? I've been, because I'm thinking about how databases worked and cost and management from many years ago. But if you think about microservices, that's also an important facet of microservices, that you have your concepts and data from a particular boundary, right? About a particular bounded idea, or eventually a bounded context. And, the perspective of what those look like, say, for example, data that seems like it might, from one boundary to another boundary, like if you're doing sales versus you're doing customer service, like if you're focused on this. And in both of those, you have customers, right? Because you're selling stuff to customers. In customer service, you're servicing and helping customers. But when you're selling to customers, like within the concept of selling, you don't really need to know very much about the customer. Within the concept of customer management, you need to know a lot, right? And keep track of every time they've called, and when they move, their new addresses and things like that. But within the context of just building an order, right? A sales order that says it's for this person, and these are the things in the order, right? You don't really need to know as much. So it's really interesting. Like, it's a different shape. It's a different description of a customer. So separating those into different databases, storing them, well, forget about the databases, but just storing them separately actually makes sense, instead of trying to have one thing represent every possible description of a customer that you might ever want, because then you're putting a whole lot of if statements into your databases. So this was a really, really hard concept, though, for me to accept, that you would have separate databases, that you wouldn't just share, have one gigantic customer table that got used by all these different pieces of your software, all these different problem sets. And, just say, well, I just want a little bit of this, or I just want those fields or those fields. And, that starts getting more complicated than just having a little customer that's, an ID and a first name and a last name, and just say, just get that, right? I just want that, or, I want this whole huge thing. So from all of my years of working with databases, it was really, really hard for me to understand the benefit of separate databases, and more importantly, like not more importantly than the databases, but of what I'm trying to share with you is not to make sure you understand why it's important to have separate databases, but I'm trying to share with you how I slowly evolved my understanding of domain-driven design by saying, okay, first I understand this, right? Then then I understand boundaries. And then, I really fought against the idea of separate databases, but eventually I got there. But the next thing I finally was able to wrap my head around, another, technical term from domain-driven design, is aggregate root. It took me a while to understand aggregate roots. It took me, some time of working with, learning better ideas, right? Working with things that are bounded. Then I started really understanding the databases, and with those things already in hand, it was easier for me to grasp the understanding of the aggregate root. Now, the next really, really hard thing for me to get my head around was something called value objects, also very important part in domain-driven design, and it is part of an aggregate, not the root of an aggregate, but so an aggregate, there's an aggregate, and then there's the root of the aggregate, right? So I had to understand all of that. So it did, again, I finally was like, oh, I get it about aggregates and aggregate roots. But aggregates also contain value objects, and value objects was probably one of the hardest things for me to understand about domain-driven design. So I'm here to tell you, as you're working on learning domain-driven design, or if you're thinking about how you're going to help other people learn domain-driven design, do not stress out if you don't understand value objects right away, right? Like I did, it took me so much. I have told this story a number of times, but I heard 5 completely different descriptions of value objects before I finally went, oh, I finally get it. And it wasn't because that fifth one was the right one. It was taking all those different descriptions and combining them, like putting all those ideas together, that finally helped me understand it, right? It was different people's ways of describing value objects. I am not going to do that right now. What I want, my point is, again, stepping through how I evolved my learning. I mean, I'm seen as a domain-driven design expert, right? But I was not out the door. So value objects, just again, don't stress out about it. If you're learning them and you're like, I don't understand them, just, keep looking for different perspectives on them, and then eventually it's going to click. Okay, then I actually made reference to this without saying it before. Ubiquitous language. This is another really key concept in domain-driven design. And when I first saw it, I didn't understand it, right? I kept seeing the term before I had a real understanding of it. This was the term that I think of when I think about trying to read a book that just kept saying ubiquitous language, and me just glazing over because I just got more frustrated every time I saw it being used, but I still didn't understand what it meant, which meant that what was being discussed was just going right over my head. I couldn't grasp it, right? And but again, going through this journey of learning more and more things about it, after I finally got it with value objects, then the concept of ubiquitous language became more clear to me. Right. So then I'm like, oh, okay, now I get it. And as a matter of fact, when I do like intro to domain-driven design, I have my own ways of describing these things to, try to help people learn them. But I am not trying to force them to, like, don't worry if you don't get it yet. Just take them in, and as Scott Hanselman says, let it wash over you. Right? Let it wash over you. It's in there. And then someday it's just going to be like a flower opening up in your head. And you're just going to go, oh, right? Like, the difference, right? When you're understanding something at first, you're like, oh, but then finally you get to, oh, right. I really, really get it. So this journey, this path was what finally, once I understood ubiquitous language, which I didn't really understand until, I got the value objects down and the aggregate root down and boundaries and domain focus. Then I was finally able to put all those ideas together, and I finally understood the bounded context. I finally got it. The most important concept in domain-driven design, I did not even understand it up front. It was a journey, and this was not a week-long journey. This was probably a, year or two long journey for me, just because of my focus and how I learn and the work that I was doing. It was a long journey, but I finally truly understood what bounded context was about. And it was about more than just something with boundaries around it. There's, all of these other things are part of what a bounded context really means. And I always have to give a nod to anti-corruption layers. Anti-corruption layers are one of the patterns we have for a bounded context communicating with maybe other services or older applications, right? If you need to have some kind of a means of communication, and they're almost like a translator. Anyway, for some reason, I have this block in my head, and I can never remember the term, right? And it's just an idea. It's not a piece of software or something, but I could never remember the term. I could always remember ACL, which also is a part of your knee that gets torn a lot, depending on how much activity you do. ACL, I would think of ACL. And then I have this picture in my head. I don't know if you've ever seen the domain-driven design fundamentals course that Steve Smith and I have done for Pluralsight, which we did a whole new version of it last year. We have a picture of these superheroes in a cape, right? So I think about them, right? They're fighting crime and fighting corruption, so anti-corruption layers. But this whole journey, right? This whole journey was how I really started understanding the mind map better and better and better. And so, I knew that mind map was there. I wasn't worrying about it, but as I learned each one of these things, I could go back and look at it in the mind map and see what it was connected to, right? And then it wasn't like a goal. It wasn't like I said, oh, now I understand aggregate roots. What's connected to that? Value objects? Okay, I'm going to learn value objects now. That was not it. It was just absorbing the ideas, and it just, and they happen to be connected to each other. So in the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about the work that I do. And I don't mean like a sales pitch. I mean, how I go about working with teams, right? So just sharing some ideas with you as you're working, trying to learn DDD or sharing it with other people. How, it's kind of a typical way of working. So remember I talked about structure before language, or, don't teach terms and then define them, show the concept and then apply the term to it. So for example, this is not, we're learning domain-driven design. This is, we're looking at your business problem and trying to create software solutions, right? So we're trying to understand the business problem. So one thing I would do, for example, would be work on something that's a really obvious transactional unit that, people in the room generally agree on, right? Or maybe, look at their, like, kind of map out, not map out, just look at all the different things that they're dealing with, all the different kind of problems that they're dealing with, and try to find things that go together, and identify some boundaries, right? And then once they understand that idea, then, for example, the transactional unit, like if we are able to really define things, rules, objects and rules, that, and behaviors that really belong together, right? And we might even look at them from different perspectives, turn them on their head, like which one of these is kind of controlling the rest, which should be, which within this transactional unit, which one of these classes or entities should be, not entity framework entities, by the way. It's kind of an overused term. Which should be responsible for maintaining, the rules within that transaction, right? Maybe it's this, maybe, wait, what if it's this, right? So we do a lot of that. Then, then I'll say, oh, by the way, in domain-driven design, that whole transactional unit is referred to an aggregate, and the class that we determined should be responsible for maintaining the rules within that aggregate, that's called the aggregate root, right? So like they already understand it. Now I'm just giving a name to it instead of doing it the other way around, right? So, we keep working, and we keep learning in that way, and then seeing how it applies to domain-driven design. And then as I'm doing that, then I'm starting to give them more and more insight into domain-driven design and how it helps, right? How these concepts help. And then we just keep working through it. And, and eventually we get to a garden. Now, you might notice that this is quite different than the ones I showed before. This is a little more my style, wild English garden, right? Not one that takes 50 people to maintain. So, eventually we get there, right? But it takes some time and some thinking and debating, and, takes some time to get there. A lot of times people will refer to this idea of learning domain-driven design kind of little by little as DDD Light, right? Or, which doesn't really have a good connotation to it, right? That it could be almost a little insulting. It's not really DDD, but, but still it is reflecting the beauty of domain-driven design, right? Reflecting the benefits of domain-driven design, even if it is, lightweight version of DDD, and maybe instead of calling it DDD, we could call it the core of DDD, like the core concepts of DDD, and using them in a way that, you can still be benefiting from them, and, hope eventually start realizing the value of some of these other concepts in there. As it's not like a goal, like, oh, we're gonna, start here, and then we have to learn this part, and then we have to learn this part. I feel, more of a natural evolution, because as you start comprehending some of the concepts, it, like, as you saw with my path, it brings light on, and I don't mean LITE, shines a light on another part of that mind map that you're finally able to go, oh yeah, I get that, and I see how that will help. Let's try that out and see what it feels like to work with that also. And another thing I think is really important about domain-driven design, when I'm teaching it, for sure, is to make sure people understand that there's really two sides of domain-driven design. Part of it, one of those sides is referred to as strategic design, and that's where you're really doing the planning, you're strategizing. Really, really important, critical thing in DDD is collaborating with the clients, actually all the way through, not just strategic design, but all the way through, working closely with the clients, because they're the domain experts. They understand the problems that, in detail, the problems that you're trying to solve, and they can help you really work through it and build beautiful software. Focusing on what we refer to as the core domain, right? Like, what's the most important thing in your business? It's like unique to your business, right? So not something generic like credit card processing, right? And saying, having an understanding of what you should be really spending your time on, right? So, like, we probably shouldn't spend our time writing another credit card processing system, because we can just, connect to one. Like, let's not waste our time on that. So that's a really important part of strategic design, understanding, getting an understanding of what the different parts are, and which you should focus on and which you should have less focus on, or no focus on, just call an API. For me, reducing complexity and stress, right? By breaking the problems down into small solvable problems, it makes me so much happier. I mean, it's just like, doing the dishes, right? After dinner. Oh, wait, first, before I do the dish, don't worry about the dishes in the sink. Let's put the food away first, right? Before the dog tries to get it off the counter, right? Just like breaking problems down and making smaller, easy to solve problems and handling them one at a time. In part of strategic design is defining those boundaries and defining those bounded contexts. And of course, ubiquitous language, understanding the ubiquitous language. And just a little clue of what I'm referring to with ubiquitous language now. It's the terms, not the terminology of DDD, like ubiquitous language and bounded context, but the terms that are important within the domain. So, like, when you're collaborating with the domain experts, what are they talking about, right? They're probably not talking about classes and properties and stored procedures, right? Use their terminology, and that terminology becomes ubiquitous throughout a bounded context. When we're talking about this, when we say customer, when we're talking about customer support and we say customer, everybody understands what we're talking about. When we're talking about sales and building a sales order, and we talk about customer, everybody understands that in that context, it has this meaning, right? So it's a ubiquitous language. So, and maybe, you know, when we're in the context of a sales order, what we think of as a customer, maybe we'll say, you know, we actually refer to them as purchasers. When we're talking about the sale order, it's not customer. We don't use that language. We use the word purchaser, right? That becomes part of the ubiquitous language of the sales order bounded context. So just to, I hate saying these terms and not even sharing anything. So the other half of domain-driven design, there's strategic and then there's tactical. So the tactical part is when you're like, okay, we've got our strategy in place. We've got our bounded context determined. We know what they are. We have our ubiquitous language. Time to roll up our sleeves. Can't see my sleeves. Roll up your sleeves and start designing our code, right? And so in tactical design, the pieces of domain-driven design, for example, aggregates, value objects, aggregate roots, all of those things, they actually, you know, is a learning curve, right? To understand them and understand how, what they are and how they should be used. But eventually when you're using those, and believe me, I have found this, I write so much better code. My code is so much cleaner and less stressful and focused, and, you know, separation of concerns and getting rid of side effects. And just, there's so much about tactical design, which is something I actually, I focus on a lot when I'm talking about entity framework and domain-driven design. How entity framework is able, you know, if I'm designing these beautiful classes that I've learned how to build with domain-driven design, how does entity framework figure out how to get them into the database, right? So there is that. So when I'm talking about entity framework and DDD, I am focused on tactical, absolutely. Most of what I do when I'm working with my clients, though, is I'm working on the strategic side. They'll bring me in when they're dealing with legacy apps, right? And they need to, you know, revise them or replace them or evolve them or whatever. And I go in and really help people get a new perspective on their business problem and how to look at it in terms of building the software, because a lot of times people get stuck in those old patterns. Well, this is the way we did it 20 years ago, and this is the way we always think about it. And it's hard for people on their own to break out of that perspective. So I work with them on that. So it's interesting. So my research and writing and presentations is a lot about a lot about tactical, because it's focused on entity framework, whereas my work with teams is quite often on the strategic end. So I get this question a lot, which is, you know, how do I help somebody get started, right? Or, you know, how do I get started? How do I get my team started? No, so sometimes it's, you know, somebody who's learned about DDD and is really, really interested in it, right? Like, how do we get there? So for the strategic side, just some concepts here. There's this workshop format called event storming, and event storming is this, oh, it's so much fun to do in person. It's totally doable, you know, virtually, but it's so much fun to do in person. I miss that terribly. So event storming is this big workshop where it's really active, and this is where we really intensely discover, like, look at our business, look at the business problem, the overall business problem, and try to discover what are the different domains, what are the different boundaries, what are the different bounded contexts. And also just a plain old brainstorming too, like just talking through the problem, understanding the workflow of the business so that you just have a better comprehension of the business. I found a lot of times that in event storming, you bring people together from different parts of the company, and people will have these conversations where they, somebody will talk about like, oh, this thing we do, and somebody from another team is like, whoa, I never knew that, right? And if you're doing that, well, this thing that I do, if I did it differently, would it make things easier for you? And they're like, oh yeah, like forget about client collaboration, teams across companies collaborating sometimes for the first time, which is amazing. What you can do on a smaller scale is, for example, for the tactical side, where you really focus on code and design, pair program, right? Pair program with somebody who knows at least some of the ideas already, and think about doing some refactoring, right? Like do some encapsulation, see if you can identify aggregates, identify the root of an aggregate, right? There's all kinds of things you can do. And I would look on YouTube, you can find, oh my gosh, my brain has just completely gone. My friend, whose name just popped right out of my head, Jimmy, forgive me, has these amazing talks on doing refactoring for domain-driven design, and he's done it a number of times over the years. All of his talks are amazing. It's going to come to me as soon as we disconnect this session. I cannot believe it. This is the problem of being home alone for 2 years. Anyway, I will just move on from that. So, in closing, these preconceived notions of domain-driven design, that there are all these rules and all these definitions that you need to understand before you can start using domain-driven design. I really think that shuts people out from being able to benefit from all of the wonderful ideas in domain-driven design. So there's all kinds of ways that you can take advantage of and benefit from just some of, one idea here, like the idea of the boundary, or an idea there, the idea of aggregates and having the root of an aggregate be responsible for everything else in the aggregate. Just little things like that. You can start taking advantage of them without doing the whole big thing, without having those ACLs, anti-corruption layers. See, I actually remembered. And then one very last small thing I want to leave you with is that client that I went to where everybody was saying, I don't want to hear anything more about domain-driven design. My last day there, one of the developers came up to me to thank me. I'm not screen sharing again. It's almost not important. I don't know where my screen went. Oh, well, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to tell you that he came up to me and he said, I never really thought about value objects before. And this is a guy who is a brilliant programmer, very experienced, and he's so smart. I never thought about value objects before, but now I get them. Like, I really get it. And I get the beauty of them and the value of them. And having seen that, now I'm really, really curious to learn more about the other things in domain-driven design and how they're going to help me as a developer building software. And I almost started sobbing because it was so great to hear that people didn't want to learn anything about domain-driven design. And, and I was able to kind of, open up his mind and give him inspiration, right? To, even with all of his experience programming, to help him continue on his learning journey, even after all those years. So thank you so much, Irina and Bogdan. Thank you for inviting me to come speak to your Romanian audience. And I know you've invited me to come there live numerous times in the past. It hasn't worked out. So I'm glad that we were able to do this today. Thanks so much. And I know there's a couple more days of workshop, so I hope everything goes beautifully. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Julie. We have some questions if you have 1 minute.
Okay. Yes, that's great. And I don't have the YouTube link open anyway.
No, we have a slide though. I think you can see my screen.
Oh, I see your screen. Yes.
Perfect.
It's over here, so pardon me.
Yeah.
My camera's there. So I'm gonna Jimmy Bogart. Oh my gosh, I've known Jimmy for like 20 years. He's a good friend, and now this is going to be on YouTube. He's going to
delete this part
on Twitter. Yes, absolutely. So Jimmy's done this. He's got beautiful talks, so many brilliant, beautiful talks. But there's one where he does this refactoring with DDD ideas, and I highly recommend it. And you could find it on YouTube. So another question I'm seeing is DDD something that you must do from the start, or do you evolve your solution to DDD when you reach a certain point? That's actually an interesting question, because it aligns very much with some of the ideas that I was trying to share, which is, DDD is this bundle of guidance and ideas, right? So if you learn something wonderful from DDD, why not look at the work you're doing and say, how can this benefit? Right. So maybe you've already, created like data model, right? You like started with a data model, right? You might step back and say, well, wait a minute, what business problems am I trying to solve? Or maybe you've already started designing your classes, right? You can look at those classes. As soon as you learn something from DDD, why not take a look at the work you're doing and see if you can just start applying it, or applying it going forward, right? So like, why do all this work and then, go back and, go, oh my gosh, I wish I had done all this other stuff now, right? Like, so I think, if whatever ideas you already know, why not start using them wherever you're at. So do you start with separate databases from the start? Same kind of idea. So first of all, I want to say that another one of the very important ideas about domain-driven design is we're focused on the domain. We're not focused on the data persistence. Like, you could write your whole application, get your whole application working and tested without having a database yet, right? So, I mean, obviously, we need to think about getting, hey, I'm a data person. We need to think about persisting that data, but it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost secondary to, developing the application. If you're thinking about the application is about solving the problem. So let's design our classes and, design our logic and our business rules and our behaviors and, design our code around, solving those business problems. And then, you can worry about getting that into the database. So here's an interesting thing, like, especially if you're like using EF core, right? A lot of these nice designs that you can do based on the ideas from domain-driven design in your, in your business logic, your domain models, a lot of that entity framework can flow right into the database really easily. So already, again, kind of backing up and focusing on the domain problems. So you've got a bounded context, right? And you're just solving some certain problems in that bounded context. And then, at some point you might say, all right, we're going to start persisting the data from that bounded context, right? And yeah, sometimes EF core will, like I said, just let things flow through. Sometimes you might have to do a little something, some extra mappings and, kind of worst case scenario, build a mapper when you've got some problems that are a little more complicated. So it's actually, once you start persisting the data from your bounded contexts, and it's a lot easier to start that persistence in the way that you want it to end up, right? It's a lot easier to start by saying, we're going to persist them in separate places, because then you know how to deal with connecting that data if necessary, right? So like one bounded context should not need data from a different database. However, it might need to get some extra data that it needs. Maybe you've got a whole bunch of foreign keys, right? But you don't need to maintain that data there, but you might have a service to, get, what does this foreign key point to? Like, I just need the name of that thing. I just need the description of that product or something like that. So, so from the start, you're not worrying about persisting data, but at the point that you start dealing with the data persistence, yeah, I would definitely, as much as you're able to, keep things in separate database, keep them separate, because then you're going to see the what you need to deal with in terms of getting data back out if as needed. That's a big topic. I actually did a talk at TechEd in 2012 or 2013, like almost 10 years ago, about this kind of a problem. Anyway, sorry, blah, 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 because, this is I love talking about this stuff.